Welcome to the Research Studio, the place where we talk to current doctoral students involved in practice-based, practice-led or practice-informed research in the arts. My name is Dr. Mark Wilsher, and I'm based at Norwich University of the Arts in the UK. I'm an artist and academic involved in doctoral supervision, and I want to use my experience of making artworks and exhibitions to think about the different roles that creative practice can play within academic research. My guest today is Tom Hull. Tom is a specialist in wild soundscapes, working on an interdisciplinary level as a composer, sound designer, and field recordist within the creative industries, and as a soundscape ecologist in the ecological sciences. Since 2012, he has developed work independently under the name Missing Wolf, and created soundscape installations and compositions. Tom is a Fellow of the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust in Science and Innovation, and an Associate of Wild Sanctuary Incorporated, the world's leading organisation in soundscape study and art. He has led soundscape research surveys in a number of the world's remote and wild places, including the United States, Europe and Asia. Tom is a part-time research student at Falmouth University, aiming to submit in 2026. His thesis is currently titled Wild Resonance: Comprehending Ecosystem Transformation Across Time in the Ecological Soundscape. Welcome, Tom.
Wow, thanks for having me. That bio I always feel like when I hear that bio back, I feel like it's almost describing someone else. So yeah, thanks for that.
Well, it's great to have you here. I thought I'd kick off by just asking you a basic question. Could you tell us a little bit about biophony and how you came to be interested in that as a subject?
Yeah, so biophony itself is actually is what we in the discipline of soundscape ecology, or what's also known as eco-acoustics. It's the biological component of the soundscape. So the biophony would be considered any biological sound and signature, and that could be intentional, so like the calls of birds or howls of wolves, or it could be unintentional, so the movement of foliage or the beating of wings or movement of water as something traverses through a habitat. So that's really one of the major components, and with the other two being geophony, which is the kind of all the geophysical sounds, so that are non-biological, could be like wind moving through the trees or the sounds of river and waterfalls. And then there's the category of anthropophony, which deals with human-generated sounds. And there's a little bit of tension between anthropophony and biophony in the fact that humans, we are biological beings and we are also animals. But for most anthropophony, for most human-generated sound, it isn't coherently part of the soundscape. So we've created this other category because of its potentially disruptive nature. But there are examples of human sort of sound and noise making that is definitely biophony. We've seen that in different areas of the equatorial rainforest and things like that. So yeah, the biophony is that major biological component, and that's the one that I'm mostly interested in as I'm really seeking to understand how ecosystems are changing over time. So the biophony is, as a living system, is the kind of really signals and expresses ecological narratives as they're taking place.
So I mentioned that you had a kind of a background in music and as a musician as well. And I'm wondering, did you come to this subject from the acoustic side of things, from listening and sound, or from the kind of ecological side of things, from your interest in conservation and biodiversity and so on?
Yeah, I think that's a really fundamental question for, and not just me, for a few of my colleagues as well. I found that I tend to be working now with people, quite a lot of us who have a background in music and sound. So it was primarily the skill set was already there for recording, for familiar with manipulating and changing audio, and working creatively really with sound. But at the time I came across soundscape ecology, I was also doing a lot of environmental activism. So a lot of direct action, a lot of boots on the ground marches. And I happened to be performing with a band I was in at the time, a Japanese taiko band, at WOMED Festival. And that's where I heard Bernie Krause, who's kind of a real pioneer of the subject and discipline of soundscape ecology. He was just speaking about the roots of kind of human music making in the wild. But as part of that, he introduced some of the major kind of theories and the kind of the paradigm of soundscape ecology as a means to understand and really determine with some real precision and nuance how ecosystems are changing and the kind of transformation that he had witnessed in his archive since recording in the 1960s, the kinds of loss and change he had witnessed there. So it was, for me, it was like this moment of intersection of something I really deeply cared about, with the opportunity to actually bring the skills that I had developed working in the arts and in music and actually directly apply them to that. So that was sort of my trajectory, and I'm not alone in that. But there's definitely distinction between those who come at it who have a data science background and those who have a more sound background, if you like.
Oh, there's so many things I want to ask you about this. I mean, I think we'll come on to talk about Bernie Krause a little bit later, but also this kind of art science thing is also a really interesting question, I think, and where you sit in relation to that. So you're studying at Falmouth University. How do you locate yourself there? Are you within a kind of an acoustics and an artistic area, or are you in the sort of science side of things?
Well, yeah, that's the bit of a. It's an odd one in one respect. I'm actually I'm technically part of the Academy of Music and Theatre Arts, and my supervisors, the team, my supervisionary team, that's probably helps work out the kind of how it's situated majorly, is that the director of studies and one of my other supervisors, Antti Saro and Dee Ferret, they're both Falmouth faculty, and they're both experts with music and sound, and coming from kind of the literature around sound studies, composition, this sort of area. And I have the other supervisor actually from Sussex University, and this is Alice Eldridge, and she brings the eco-acoustics and the science as well, even though her background was also in music and she is a musician and amongst other things, but then she also has this expertise dealing with eco-acoustic study. So really at Falmouth it's an odd one in terms of where it sits, because it doesn't really sit comfortably in the arts, what I do, totally. But I've also found in science settings I don't totally sit in those either, and I suppose sometimes that's the nature of, if you are working in an interdisciplinary manner, bits of your work will sit really well in certain areas and bits won't, and I think that's just the nature of the beast,
Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you came to turn this into a PhD. So it's obviously something you were interested in. What was it that made you decide, okay, this is what I want to spend X number of years doing, and put it within that academic framework?
Yeah, I think really a big part of this was whilst working with Wild Sanctuary and working on my own projects, certain things became apparent about the workflows that were available, the kinds of practice that was being kind of furthered academically by my peers. And I think for me it was two things really. One thing was I realised that we were working in a way that maybe wasn't being as considered. So there was a qualitative practice. There was a practice of like recording, a way of analysing and doing things, which wasn't necessarily being pushed in the same way as sort of maybe the quantitative data science aspect of the discipline was. So that was on the one hand. The other side of it was there was no real way to study this subject otherwise. There's no kind of courses that are eco-acoustics or soundscape ecology courses specifically. Definitely not in the UK. Even though there are practitioners who are picking up the subject, and it's sort of starting to appear in different institutions. So this was a way of trying to drive that forward as well. So also driving forward the ability to bring this into the academy, but to explore it in the academy and to bring what it does outside of the academy kind of into the way we talk about sound in general, how we talk about the environment, so all these sort of different disciplines. So yeah, I think it was twofold really for that. One thing, I felt there was something that needed to be contributed, but also the most direct way of doing that was to take up the PhD. Yeah.
So I think you mentioned that you were at WOMAD and you heard Bernie Krause talking there, which is one of the things which got you involved in this area. And then you received a grant, didn't you, to go out and study, or is this right, to go out and meet Bernie Krause in California?
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. That's a fantastic organisation actually, and I would really encourage anyone, as long as you're a British citizen, I'd encourage anyone to apply, and it's the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust. They were known at the time. They're now just called the Churchill Fellowship. And what I love about this organisation so much is I wrote to them as a composer, applying for a science and innovation grant, saying, look, I want to go out to California. I'm going to go work with this guy for 6 weeks. He's up for it. We're ready to go. We just need that money in place so we can do it. And the first question they're asking me, obviously, is in the interview, because after there's a few stages involved, a few written applications, and then in the interview itself, there was a big panel, maybe 4 or 5 people. Some people from the Natural History Museum. You had professors of kind of physics and sort of deal with studying at the university. Quite well thought of people. I remember them asking me, "You're a composer. This is a science and innovation grant."
Yeah. What are your credentials?
Yeah, exactly. Which were none, actually, except for enthusiasm and some passion for the subject. And I think that's why they're a fantastic organisation, because they, out of any kind of funding body that I've dealt with, I really feel like they are looking to fund people with a passion for something. So it's not needing to be, oh, you're already really established, so we'll support you. It was more of a case of, well, you've got this set up. You're the one who can go and do it, and you're the one who wants to go and do it. So, yeah, here you go. Here's the money, and go and do it. So, yeah, like I say, highly encourage anyone to apply for that. And at any point of your career, any point of your own life, it's the thing. As soon as you see something that you like, there's something going on. There's practice happening somewhere else in the world, and you're like, well, if I can go there, I can travel, and I can bring that knowledge back. And that's sort of their remit is travel to learn, return to inspire, I think was their tag. So yeah, great organisation.
And what did you actually do out there? What did you learn from Bernie Krause? Did you go to? I understand you visited some of the sites which he'd recorded. Is that right, in the past? So he was. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about him as a kind of figure in this world.
Yeah, sure. So Bernie was his first iteration. His career was working in music, and he worked a lot. Really, one of the major contributions to the music industry was his kind of pioneering with the Moog synthesizer. If anyone's familiar with this, and him and his music partner Paul Beaver, they spent a lot of time in the studios with lots of bands, very famous names, kind of from the Beatles to Stevie Wonder and all kinds, like working with the Moog synthesizer, and then also working on films like Apocalypse Now and things like that. And I think for Bernie, when Paul Beaver passed away, and I think for him this was marking an end to kind of being in music. It just wasn't feeling right. But they had been doing a project called Into a Wild Sanctuary, and as part of that, Bernie had to go out into a forest. And I think it was just outside of San Francisco, so not a particularly wild location, but had to visit this forest. And he talked about this trepidation, this kind of fear. And kind of concern, because he wasn't used to being in these anywhere remotely natural in some respects. But he speaks about putting on the headphones and recording, and how that just changed his whole perception of the environment. Suddenly, the heightened sense and what could be noticed. So from that moment on, he started dedicating himself to recording kind of natural and wild soundscapes, and through that kind of process of being in the field and field recording, to make high quality, high fidelity field recordings, a lot of them which were aimed at being originally commercialized for films. He kind of started to stumble upon different hypotheses about how soundscapes function, how they operate, and work with other colleagues around him. They started to develop what would then become soundscape ecology, and now known also as eco-acoustics. So he's kind of a founding father of that field, but because of the time he's been working for, he also has one of the longest standing archives, which he started recording in 1968. So in some ways, he also has this incredibly precious historical record. So, that's kind of who I came across, really, was this person who had this experience, had developed a lot of this stuff, and had a real sensibility towards how to go about engaging with the soundscape, how to go about translating that into other pieces of art, and how to go about perceiving it.
So when you visited there, did you pick up particular kind of qualitative techniques and processes for making these recordings? Yeah,
for sure. That was a major thing that that Bernie and colleagues had really developed was a really strict field recording protocol. So this is probably one of the places where you could start seeing anything that would be considered like practice, where it starts to emerge. And this field recording protocol it's in some ways incredibly simple, but it just lays out the kinds of ways that the recorder is set, the kinds of information you take, the style of recording, the calibration that we use so that we can compare the recordings, and just the general practice of what's expected in order to make this to add that rigor. So that's the thing that he majorly introduced me to, and the thing he'd also really developed. The second part of that actually was on the other end of that. So you could say that beginning of the arc of being involved in the practice of soundscape ecology would be to record would be the start. The middle you could see as the analysis or the interpretation, like the engagement with the soundscape, and the end would be that demonstration. The two sides where I think Bernie's done a lot of work, and that's where he'd really pushed the field forward, was partly in the recording protocol, but also in the demonstration of it and the curation of soundscapes into kind of major pieces of art. The biggest one of which being the Great Animal Orchestra exhibition funded by Fondation Cartier. But and so when I was in California, that's the two things he really took me through, was how we record and then how we can curate these things and how to engage with the soundscape in that way. Yeah.
So I guess it brings a real kind of scientific rigor to the recording. So they're all set with consistent parameters. So it's possible then to compare a recording from 1968 with a recording from 2024, perhaps, because that they've been broadly similar. Yeah, fantastic. I think we'll get on to the idea of listening and kind of analysis of these in a little while. I wonder if you could maybe paint a picture for us of a little bit about what it's like doing a recording. How do you set yourself up? Are you sitting right there? Are you off at a distance with your headphones on? Or what's it like when you're out in the field making these recordings? Because you've been all over the world, as I mentioned at the start.
Yeah, no, it's I think it's one of the things that majorly attracted me to doing this anyway. And the style of recording that I'm using is not, and the one that kind of Bernie taught me is not necessarily the standard for eco-acoustics now. Nowadays, the protocol tends to be setting remote units out, called autonomous recording units, and they're set to record at certain times of day, for certain periods of time, and so they're sampling the soundscape, and they don't tend to have such good quality in terms of what they produce, and you could argue nowadays there's maybe something missing in not being present. So what I do instead is my practice tends to be to go out to these places, and we set up recording equipment that some of it may find a home in a recording studio rather than in a forest. But we set up, and often that involves either hiking out pre-dawn, so you're hiking out in the dark, or camping out in places. So you're sort of doing an overnight protocol where you'd record the dusk, go to sleep or try, and then you record the dawn chorus. We tend to focus on because we tend to focus on the dawn because it's the most active period. It often involves very early hours, so it can be quite a crunch if you're doing this for a couple of weeks. So you're sort of getting up at 2 a.m. and recording. But really, the process would be, we hike out and you're in the silence, and this is the same for deserts and in forests. There's nothing really going on at night at that time. Maybe the occasional owl, or there's some bats and some animals present, but there's not much sound. And you'd set up in that darkness, Often we then roll in cables out, so you're kind of maybe sitting 30 feet away. You got your headphones on, and you just sit there, and we start recording in the dark before anything happens, because we want to pick up that onset of the dawn chorus and the world coming to life. But one of the things that always feels quite profound in those moments is that from the dark and the sun coming up and that kind of the amount of sound and the amount of life that suddenly appears, that's often sometimes the most profound thing to experience, because you realise that whilst you felt like you were quite alone in the dark setting up, actually surrounding you was just all this life, just waiting for its moment to actually kind of start vocalizing. So that's kind of the central part of that practice, is then to just listen. And we you might be recording for 2 hours, and in that period you have it to be deadly silent. You can't move. The more you move, the more work you have later on to take yourself out of the recording. It's about you are focused for that time. So after the recording, you can be quite a mindful experience. It can feel quite it does set you up for the day. You might feel exhausted before you record, but after you've sat and listened for this time, there's a kind of a sense of rejuvenation and alertness that comes from having spent that much time and focus. Listening through what's quite an augmented process as well. The microphone's really heightening the sound, so you're having a very different experience of the habitat that you're kind of situated in.
So you're listening through headphones. Is that right? Rather than, you're not just sitting there next to the microphone, but you're actually sitting there and you're wired up and you're listening to what the microphone's picking up. So it is enhanced.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it depends. Not always. You might not run headphones if you've got really limited amount of battery supply. Headphones take up quite a lot of power to run. So if you've got really limited on how much time you can be in the field, you might not. But I think often that practice is really good to listen on site like that, because you're then engaging with you can then hear a lot. You can hear a lot more. You've got a massive dynamic range, which you're now able to pick up. And it allows you to engage with that recording as it's taking place in a way that when you come back to it to listen to it later on, there is a relationship you're already forming from having listened on site, which I think really helps navigate and understand what's happening, when you listen back.
Do you think that being engaged in this practice has changed the way you listen? I mean, how do you listen? And I think in one of the blogs that I read that you've written about this, you talk about deep listening. Could maybe say a little bit about how you listen to these recordings and the state of mind you're in. Yeah,
I mean, I think it's like with anyone, right? If you meet writers or filmmakers or musicians, when you engage with something in a deeper way, you can end up becoming critical of it in ways that you might not otherwise. So I know that from my work with music, often the music I'm listening to, even though you as a musician you do enjoy it, you have pretty eclectic taste because you're engaging with all kinds of different types of music, but you do have a critical ear and you start to maybe engage with it on a kind of how it was made, sort of the function in it, the craft in it, if you like, not just the art. And I suppose to some extent with the soundscape and listening, one of the first things that does change is your sort of awareness of the function, of the craft, of the biophony, like what's in it, what's happening in that soundscape. Or certain anthropophony then might actually become really irritating. It does change your relationship to the world because you're now noticing things in a different way. So even just bringing attention to it, which I think even in 2020, in lockdown, where maybe we had quietened down or some of us had some time, people were starting to notice, there's like this thing going on outside. There's birds singing. It's like so they're noticing the biophony. So that's kind of the first one. Since then, for what I do now and where my research has taken me, that's shifted into creating more precise ways of listening with intended purposes. And I think those methods are, on the one hand, they are a tool, and on the other hand, they are, I guess, they fundamentally, it's like a skill you can practice. And I suppose if you spend time with those, then ultimately that becomes more accessible. So you might find that you don't need to necessarily sit down in the same way and take the same amount of time to get into gear with listening, especially if you're currently doing it a lot. So then that does infiltrate other areas of your life, I think, and the ability to sort of switch through different modes of listening whilst listening to something has definitely taken place, yeah.
So the way I understand your thesis, as it's currently kind of organised, is that you are revisiting sites that have been recorded in the past. Is this right? So are you revisiting sites which have been recorded by the Bernie Krause archive and they already exist? And then the idea is that you compare the modern recordings with the historic recordings.
Yeah, in essence, that simplicity of it would be we just revisit a site and record and then compare and contrast. The recordings I'm working from, some of them come from the Bernie Krause Natural Sound Archive, which is Wild Sanctuaries archive, and the other ones come from the Nature Sound Society archive. So they're also working in Yosemite, and they have their own recording protocol, but it's kind of they work in a similar way. And they've been monitoring national parks as well for I'd say probably since 2010. So maybe just over between 10 and 15 years. So the recordings I worked with were all across California, in the Mayacama mountain range and across the Sierra Nevada. And some of them had actually quite a lot of recordings represented. So they were recorded every year, sometimes a few times each year. So we could actually then compare and contrast not just 2 points, but actually year to year over a 20-year period, this sort of time frame. The one set of locations in Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park, which came from a study that Bernie did with Stuart Gage, the late professor Stuart Gage. They'd only recorded in 2002. So we went back to record some in 2022 to sort of just not to. In this way, you can't necessarily gauge the transformation in the same way, but it was just to sort of see if we take these 2 points at that different in time, and there were 4 habitats included in that study. What does that say? What does that tell us? What story can emerge just from those 2 points with that amount of time and space in between? Especially when we have 4 habitats kind of across Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park which feature. So there's 2 kind of distinct types of a kind of audio set, if you like. One of them is there's those 2 points, and the others we actually have kind of every year represented at least once. So that gives us a kind of better temporal resolution, if you like, to deal with.
Maybe we should talk a little bit about actually how these are analysed now. So you talked about listening to the recordings, and I've seen online that the recordings are also often kind of visualised as like a spectrograph. So you have kind of basically sort of a heat map over different frequencies as they appear in the timeline. But when you come to compare these recordings, what are you actually doing? Is it just as simple as saying, 20 years ago there were like loads of birds, and now there's only a couple of birds? Or is it much more? I mean, I imagine it's much more sophisticated than that, right?
Well, yeah. I think in one instance, if you were comparing a location and that was the case, it might just be, that's what's happened. There's a really distinct change, and you can maybe it's so evident that you can just pick up on it. Then the challenge would be to kind of understand what that change signals and signifies about an ecosystem and why that might have come about. But on the other hand, sometimes, especially if you're listening across 20 years or so, some of these changes and transformations, they don't happen in a totally linear way. So you don't just go from A to B. And if there's change, that's say there is a drop in biodiversity generally, it may not be, and is not likely to be, just a straight line of a downward curve. So what instead, and this is part of what my thesis is wanting to put forward, is that when we're listening, that we actually start to listen to the dynamic range, so the kind of equilibrium of that soundscape. So when we listen now, we've got different types of listening modes that have different functions. So some might be for listening to kind of multiple streams of sound. Some could be for zooming into particular singular streams. Some are for exploring and listening for new phenomena. And this gets more complicated again in my research. Maybe we can touch on some of that, how I create these chain modes with them for more precision. But you apply these ways of listening, and they might be better suited for picking out different features. And some of these features could be very specific. So we could be listening for the kind of amount of acoustic niche bandwidths that are occupied. So this kind of relates on the fact that the soundscape is organized in a way that the organisms organize themselves into bands so that they can be, so they have like a free channel in which to vocalize. It's like if you imagine tuning through a radio stations. Yeah. And so what we've observed, and especially you can see in a lot of recordings in Gurney's archive that are from jungles, especially in the kind of tropical zones, these bandwidths are incredibly defined, and you can zoom in, especially on insect bandwidths. You zoom in and in on the spectrogram, and absolute to the kind of the micro detail and shifting in frequency bandwidths, you have different species of insects. So partly you might be listening for those bandwidths. You might then use the spectrogram to sort of, whilst listening, help determine what bandwidths are occupied. And a similar thing, you can look at the kind of the spread of acoustic energy across the whole spectrogram, and that'll also tell you something about how things are changing. The thing about all of those things is they can be quantified as well. So that's kind of where the quantification and the use of acoustic indices come in. Where I think listening can play certain other roles, where it can pick out things that can't be quantified. So when we talk about biodiversity, especially acoustically, we can understand that in different ways. It might be like the richness would be like how many different species, where the abundance might be kind of how many individuals of one type of species. And then you've got the dominance, like who's the most prevalent in the soundscape. And I think the dominance is often one of the more interesting things to pick out. It can't be easily quantified. So there are certain AI tools now getting better at identifying birds. But in terms of trying to pick out those whose voices are the most present, that's something we can really do through listening. So we can start to look at kind of a biodiversity through these different features, and you're kind of listening and comparing with all of those. So the complexity kind of opens up as the deeper you dive into the soundscape, So the way we'd often always recommend to start is you kind of listen first just for what's there, and that's where we come to biophony, geophony, and anthropophony. You might just say in the first instance, that's it. Is it? Oh, there's biophony. What kind? Oh, it's avian. Oh, there's anthropophony. Oh, there's planes flying over. And it's just this process of starting on the kind of macro, and then you zoom in and you go into the detail. And sometimes it's when you get into that very close detail that what at first may not seem like very significant changes, you start to actually pick out, there is stuff going on here. There are fluctuations, and I can see these trends now occurring over 20 years. So it's very much an art form rather than a direct craft in that way. I'd say it takes it's about a lot about the individual involved, which partly is an issue with it, the subjectivity involved, but also there's a power to it, in terms of bringing people's perception to it and engaging in that way, in a deep way.
But I can see also how you make this move from a kind of a real qualitative style of listening, maybe on site at the time, and then as you're kind of doing your first like analysis of the recordings, I can see how there's a real move from that to then, as he's described, zooming in and honing in on particular aspects of the whole recording to start to pull out stuff which actually can be quantified, and you start to move then into this kind of more sort of scientific validity, sort of basis of validity. Yeah,
for sure.
Is that when you're thinking about putting together your thesis? Let's talk PhD now. Let's talk thesis. As you come to kind of package it up and deliver it, and you're as I mentioned, you're aiming for completion in 2026. Is that right? Still?
Yeah. If I can sooner, but we'll see. See how these things go.
Are you? I guess what I'm asking is, are there particular processes of listening and analysis which you've developed, which are going to be one of your kind of main claims to novelty and new knowledge, or is it going to be more to do with the observations and the conclusions you can draw through these site comparisons over time, or both?
Well, yeah, I think you've kind of picked up on both of the contributions that I'm kind of asserting, and really as you talked about at the beginning, if we look at the arc of the practice, you'd say of doing this, that it starts with the recording and you could say it ends with the curation. In the middle, there was this analysis part, and that's kind of when I came to do the PhD, the intention was originally just to answer questions around how have these ecosystems changed. So and that contribution still is very much part of the thesis, but that was the real drive. But when I came to do it, it occurred to me that in terms of working with these high fidelity recordings where, you can quantify them, but because there's not as many data points as if you like, you need often with quantitative work, you have to have maybe hundreds and thousands of data points in order to make statistics. So we needed to work in a different way. So I felt, okay, to work qualitatively, to really engage with the soundscape through listening and through these sort of other practices that, in some way Bernie and colleagues are doing, but they hadn't been formalized. We hadn't really thought about how do we tell someone else how to do this? If you're not Bernie Krause, how do you engage with these things?
Yeah.
So a big part of the thesis then, really became about developing a kind of systematic process for doing that, and this is what I've come to now call the sonic method. And really, the sonic method just relies on, in essence, it has very simple things it does. The first hand, it's an iterative process of and that's where it really comes, really relates to practice research in its simplest form. It's a matter of, listening, reflecting, kind of over extended periods of time. And they kind of form these listening sessions, and, there's things that you might be listening for in those sessions, and that helps kind of ring fence the thing you're trying to do in that moment, because otherwise the biophony can be so complex. Listening for everything at once is really difficult. Yeah. So that's the first part of it. We then have another stage, which is what we call sonic key marks. I'm sorry for the jargon that we're introducing to the field, but sonic key marks we've started to have identified now as sort of features that have ecological and cultural significance that you could be listening for. And they're also kind of organized. So this is just giving a little bit of a manual about someone who knows nothing about soundscape, that you can say, here's how to conduct some listening. Here's some things to listen for. And then the last stage of that was really, how do you listen? And that's where I've created this sort of typology of 90 chain modes. And it seems like quite a lot, but the reason that method, that kind of typology or that modality emerged, is because really how listening functions. So we have to engage with the fact that listening is quite multimodal. It's simultaneous. You've kind of got listening that's operating in the background of your consciousness as much as, listening in readiness or even listening in search of something. And those things can be happening at once. So the matrix I developed happens in that way. So you've got the two axes of one develops sort of different types of attention. Underneath that, you have different types of focus. So you could be listening in the background very synthetically. So you're kind of listening to the general scene in the background. So if you're at a restaurant with a friend and you're probably still monitoring the scene. If someone breaks a glass, it would draw your attention, for instance. But at the same time, when you're in that conversation with your friend, you may be listening in readiness, analytically. So you're kind of listening kind of to their voice specifically for what they're saying. Then what we do on the x-axis is then combine a sort of type of intention. So that intention could be to monitor. As we said, you might be monitoring the scene. It could be to diagnose, or it could be to explore, or it could be to compare. So that kind of enters that modality. You combine all that, then you've got these 90 listening modes. So that's that's the technical drive of what I've kind of come up with, is this systematic process. But the idea of identifying these sorts of modalities is to actually be able to pick them up, and like putting on some different headphones or using binoculars. It's that you're consciously changing the way that you're engaging with something by attending to these ways of listening. So I think, in one way I can be aware of it, but I think to really do it does take quite a conscious effort. But it's something you can apply across your life. Those modes they're not specifically just for, even though I've designed these chain modes for that application, and the modes I selected to form each of these kind of chain modes had the intention of ecological analysis. You could apply them to music or to kind of all kinds of situations.
Well, actually, I was going to ask that. Yeah, I mean, as you're describing these different modes of listening, I was thinking about kind of writers and theorists that I'm aware of to do with sound, and I've read a few people like David Toop and so on. But do these kind of modes, have they come from somewhere, or are they modes that you have invented yourself? Because it sounds like a really fascinating spectrum of ways of describing listening.
Yeah, Yeah, and I think these things definitely they do come from other places. So all the initial modes they are supported by kind of previous literature and authors who've done a lot of work. And anyone who's done any kind of work in sound studies and listening in particular, there's a huge body of literature actually, and really a lot of work done in terms of discussing listening across all kinds of paradigms, from looking at kind of positionality, kind of post-colonialism, all kinds of different factors. So there's a lot you can listen to, look and read. So for what I needed to do, I think to help establish the sonic method and what I was proposing, rather than everything kind of being emergent, kind of being inductive from the process, it was important to establish and situate some of that in existing kind of ways of doing and working. Hence, sort of certain iterative processes, kind of, they're tried and tested, and there's good evidence for them and their effective nature. In the same way for these modes of listening, it was like, okay, what have other people come across? How do they define those? How have they applied those? Because it helps kind of create a much stronger foundation for this method. So they do come from some other places, and I even though in their combination, that's kind of the unique thing I suppose I've done here with these chain modes, is that create this matrix that combines them. Even though it creates 90 different ways of listening, from the plethora of ways you can listen, I chose a very small amount that felt manageable for, because it had to be practical. This has to be it's to be applied. But there are taxonomies for listening that, for radio and broadcasting, for film, for the soundscape. There's some medical. You think about how doctors apply their listening and other things. And so that's kind of the, that was the rationale for one needing to find others, but also that the good work's been done. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. So that those things are there, and they can be added to, right? The taxonomy I create it's not to say this is it. This is just a place you can start. You could add other modes into that as required, really.
Something I wanted to ask you, Tom, was about the concept of wildness. Your thesis is currently titled Wild Resonance. And I wondered, what does the idea of wildness mean to you?
Yeah, that's a good question with wildness. What I don't know if there's a really great book called The Abstract Wild, and it was that work really for me. This concept of wildness is situated because it's where you might think of wilderness as a place. We could think of wildness as a quality. So in that way, different places might have varying degrees of wildness. And wildness in this sense, if we take it right back to kind of its roots, the word wild, the etymology of it is to kind of mean to be self-willed and self-governed. So if we can think about places and whole ecosystems as how are they functioning, how are they under their self-will? Are they... how, alternative to being compromised, how much has it been changed and shaped? So you might say that certain forests, like for me, the Maramuresh forest, the virgin forest up in northern Romania on the border of Ukraine, they are some of the most wild habitats I've ever been in terms of their quality of wildness. Probably the first time in my life I felt I'd ever stood in an actual functioning forest, because these forests had never been clear cut, they'd never been cut at all. They had functioning growth and decay. There were these cycles where you could see that there was the habitat was functioning, it was being in its full intention. So it was happening under its own will, if you like. I mean, kind of grey as those words, but then you can compare that to like what in Britain we see as nature as often countryside, and arguably a farm and a lot of the forests we might be looking at are industrial. Their industrial landscape. So you could say they're kind of another layer down from their wildness, but they're probably going to have a higher level degree of wildness than a high street in central London, So we've got different ways of understanding this, and it might be that you live somewhere really urbanized, but there's a river that runs through it. And it often is the case that rivers will have a higher degree of wildness. There'll be things down by the river. There'll be a functionality. It won't, it's the degree to which it's wild is always going to be in flux with the kind of impacts and effects around it. And that's definitely to say now that all habitats we record, and that's a definitely important part of my study, every habitat I work in and have recorded is already massively entangled with kind of impacts of climate change and other things. So this I think we are often now dealing with kind of ranges and kind of degrees to which we can understand what things are. So wildness for me in that way really comes in those terms. And I think it's a really valuable way of trying to understand how ecosystems function, because we can start to appreciate an ecosystem in its across the kind of life that's there, and in its own right. So rather than seeing broken and dead trees as, oh God, it's a broken tree, we need a dead tree, got to cut it and just clear cut that, get rid of it. We can actually no, now it changes, it serves, it shifts its function. It's as a being, it's changed what it does. It becomes a home now for owls. There's different growth and decay that's required for it to restore the rest of the forest. So there's ways that we can start to understand our environment by that degree. So that's, wildness I think is a really beautiful concept, and I think one definitely worth considering, like as you just wander about now, start picking out the kind of degrees of wildness in your gardens and your homes. There might be that cupboard in the kitchen that feels like it has that higher degree of wildness.
You're definitely making me want to go outside and just listen and see what I can find out there. Although here, I think it's going to be mostly traffic. Okay, and then finally, I guess, is there anything else you'd like to say? Anything that I should have asked you, or anything that you'd like to kind of get out there?
Yeah, I think really, like, one thing that's really important when talking about any of this kind of work is really just to, often I like to situate soundscape ecology and the efforts in the context of the kind of what's happening around the world. A lot of it we're really familiar with. And, one of the real striking kind of, details from Bernie's archive is that from 1968, his assertion now is that like around 50% of that archive is now either unrecognizable or functionally extinct. So we know that soundscapes are being rapidly changed, and for all kinds of reasons. That could be because of sound pollution, it could be because of changes in ecosystems. So there is a real imperative, I think, for people to be involved in this field from all kinds of different disciplines. That isn't just to do the recording and the study and the analysis. It can be to translate those findings. Really, really important to get all boots on the ground, because actually, if you imagine a world without that surrounding voice, the biophony, it's quite a terrifying one, because really what's out there is incredible, and it's a really amazing thing to engage with. So I suppose on one instance, rather than getting caught up in all the technical details of everything we might discuss around practice of soundscape ecology, one of the beauty of it is that actually the first instance it's quite easy to engage with. If you have good hearing, you can go out and listen. Even if you can't listen and you haven't got good hearing, you can use a spectrogram and other visual tools to help you engage with that world, or vibration and other things can connect you to that soundscape. So yeah, I think it's really just that's the kind of a takeaway that I think is important about this, is that there's something there, and I think we should be paying attention to it. And hopefully, if the more we bring that into our culture, the kind of, I think that would really have an impact on how we relate to the world around us, and can really help reorientate us to that other life. So yeah, I suppose that would be it.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I think that's a great place to stop. So thank you so much, Tom Hull, and best of luck as you head towards completion.
No, well, thank you very much for inviting me on, and and just having a chat about soundscapes and everything else. So thank you very much.